There are no accidents in life. Everything has a reason. Even if it seems to you that something is wrong, it means that it is. I have seen this from my own experience. My wife was a wonderful woman whom I loved very much. We had children, a house, everything was fine until she started cheating on me. I guess I'll start my story from when I was a child. I reckon I was around 5 or 6 when my folks decided to get a holiday caravan down on the south coast near Weymouth. From then on, every school break we'd head down there for our vacations. Naturally, Dad couldn't always join us due to his work, so most of the time it was just Mom, my 2 sisters, and me. After a couple of years, Dad upgraded to a larger caravan, and we started inviting various friends and relatives to join us for a break from the city. Several families from various parts of the country also had caravans on the site. When my mom took us there alone without Dad's car to go out in, my sisters and I would explore the site and the local area. We were fortunate to have a family car in the 1950s. Not many families had cars back then, and unfortunately, my mother never learned to drive, although she did manage to terrify a couple of driving instructors before giving up on the idea. There were always other children on the site for me to play with, but my sisters considered themselves too mature to play with boys. My closest friend during those times was Harry. Harry, who was a year older than me, and I immediately got along the first time we met, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. Harry had a large red birthmark covering the left side of her face, which, for reasons I couldn't comprehend at the time, led most other kids to avoid her. However, her birthmark never bothered me, and despite her being a real tomboy, we became good friends during my time there. In fact, if Harry's family didn't go to Weymouth during any given school holiday, I found the place terribly dull. With Harry being an only child, we felt more like siblings than just friends. My 2 older sisters were rather snobbish when they were younger. As time passed and we grew older, Harry and I gradually lost interest in climbing cliffs and tossing stones into the sea. Over the years, we had thoroughly explored every corner of our surroundings. We discovered places where we could discreetly observe young couples embracing, which was amusing when we were 10, trying to comprehend their actions. However, as we matured and gained insight into the world, we began to feel uneasy about spying on them. Together, without exchanging words, our close friendship allowed us to sense each other's inner discomfort. By that time, Harry and I were deemed old enough to take the bus to Weymouth by ourselves, where we roamed the town and harbor. Occasionally, insensitive remarks were made about Harry's appearance, leading to a few altercations with other children. I knew it deeply troubled Harry when people commented on her appearance. Around the age of 12, Harry began using makeup to conceal her birthmark. Personally, I thought it made it look worse than the birthmark itself, but I never voiced my opinion. Harry and I used to attend the dances at the club on the caravan site. We had been going there for years, enjoying the children's entertainment in the morning and then dancing as the day progressed. The dancing sessions were divided by age groups, with younger kids dancing in the afternoon, older ones in the early evening, and adults later on. As Harry and I grew older, we joined the older kids' dancing sessions. The bouncers at the club were familiar faces to us, and they quickly intervened if anyone ever made a remark about Harry's birthmark. I felt they were keeping an eye on me, knowing I wouldn't tolerate anyone upsetting Harry. During Easter when I was 15, Harry disappeared. My family and I went to Weymouth before Good Friday, and I immediately went to Harry's caravan only to find it closed for the winter. Inquiries at the site office revealed that the caravan had been sold. The rest of that holiday was the worst I had ever experienced. My parents took me out every day. Years later, my dad confided in me that he had tried to uncover what had happened to Harry and her family. It wasn't until much later that he revealed Harry's father had succumbed to influenza during the winter. Unable to maintain the caravan, Harry's mother had sold it. My dad had hoped to locate Harry's address so I could correspond with her, but his efforts were in vain. Harry and I were friends in Weymouth, but it never occurred to us to exchange addresses and keep in touch. All I knew was that she lived somewhere near Bath. Once Harry was gone, Weymouth lost its allure for me. That summer, while my mother and sisters went to Weymouth, I stayed home with my dad. We visited Weymouth briefly during his summer break from work, but the rest of the time I hung out with my school friends. The next year, my mother decided it was time for us to catch up with the latest trend, going abroad for our summer vacation. I suspect my sisters, who were already seeing boys, started pushing her not to be away from their current partners for so much of the year. We sold the caravan and embarked on a couple of weeks under the sun. Interestingly, we didn't fly. Instead, we took a train, a journey lasting 24 hours. I accompanied the family on their initial trips to Spain and Italy. However, by the time I turned 18, I preferred to travel with my friends, so I stopped going with them. Pop festivals were becoming popular at that time, and that's where my friends and I went whenever we had the chance. It was the 60s, and we had a blast for a few years. After finishing college, I tried numerous jobs without being able to settle into any of them. By then, I owned a 1959 Hillman Minx, my own little haven on wheels. One day, when my boss said something disagreeable, though I can't recall exactly what, I promptly told him to shove his job, which I detested anyway, and walked out. Not long after, while waiting at a red light, I felt a jolt as someone rear-ended my Hillman. Stepping out, I was met by a contrite truck driver who profusely apologized. The details of our conversation escaped me, but it concluded with me trailing him back to his nearby yard, where his boss assured me they would cover the cost of a new rear bumper and have it installed the next day. I drove my car to the transport yard to get the new bumper installed. While I waited in the reception area, something unexpected occurred. A man appeared at the door and beckoned me to follow him. Without question, I complied. I never quite understood why I didn't inquire about his intentions. As he directed me to sit in the driver's seat of a truck, I remained silent as he demonstrated the controls and explained the gearbox layout. When he instructed me to exit the yard and turn left, I simply started the engine and followed his directions. I ended up driving the truck for about 30 minutes before returning to the yard. Upon parking the truck, he remarked, "You've got potential. In my opinion, you're a natural." With that, he left and headed back to the office. I followed him, and as we entered the room, the boss I had met the day before emerged from an inner office and addressed the man, saying, "Mitch, didn't I tell you to take that guy for a driving assessment?" "I did. He'll be fine." "How did you manage that when he's still in my office?" "Well, being unemployed at the time, I ended up getting the job while the other guy didn't." The next Monday, I was out on the road as a truck driver. I must admit, I really enjoyed it. Initially, I had no clue what I was doing, but I discovered I had a natural knack for direction. In those days, drivers looked up for each other, and I owe a lot to those who taught me how to load trucks properly and secure them with ropes and sheets. Being on the road suited me perfectly. It was the first job I truly enjoyed and settled into. Soon, several companies were specifically requesting me when they needed a truck, which pleased my boss as it demonstrated I was doing a good job and keeping his customers satisfied. At Marshall's, a place I frequented for picking up loads, there was a girl named Thelma working in the dispatch office. Thelma embodied the essence of allure. She deliberately dressed to attract attention from the men, reveling in their admiration. Her choice of short skirts and tight blouses accentuated her stunning physique, while her high heels showcased her legs flawlessly. From the moment I first encountered Thelma at Marshall's, I perceived her as someone who enjoyed playing with others' desires. While I pride myself on being adept with women, I refuse to be the type who drools over a nice pair of legs or an appealing rear end. Instead, I maintained a professional demeanor in my interactions with her, unlike the foolish individuals who chased after her. Whenever I called Marshall's, it was strictly for business as Thelma handled dispatch duties. Over time, I found myself increasingly frequenting Marshall's until it seemed like I was exclusively working for them alongside a couple of our other drivers. I have to admit, I enjoyed working for them. It felt like being part of one big happy family. That's more than can be said for most companies. We had free reign of the place while waiting for our loads and could access the canteen whenever we pleased. Old Man Marshall prided himself on knowing every member of his 200-strong workforce by name. Before long, he knew my name and those of the other two drivers from our company who regularly worked for him. It was early December when I pulled into our yard one Friday night to refuel and collect my wages. As I stepped into the office, Mr. Wilkins, my boss, emerged and inquired, "So, what's on your agenda for tomorrow then?" It was a familiar question, usually signaling his request for me to do a driving job on Saturday. Nothing out of the ordinary. "What's the plan then, boss?" I responded. "Do you have a decent suit, lad?" we're attending Marshall's Christmas party. He invites us every year, and if we don't all show up, the old man will be upset. Sounds good to me, boss. I clean up nicely when necessary, you know. All right, I'll pick you up at the yard at 6:30. George and Jack are carpooling, but there's plenty of space in my car for you. You can ride with my wife and me. I wondered why George and Jack weren't riding with the boss and his wife in his spacious Jag that easily accommodated 5, but I kept quiet. The next day, I felt a bit out of place, like a dressed-up turkey. Being on the road, I hadn't needed to wear any of my suits. I hopped into my boss's car for the ride to Marshall's factory, where the event was happening in the huge canteen. Mr. Wilkins insisted I call him Bill for the evening, but I knew come Monday it would be back to boss again. He introduced me to his lovely wife, and I couldn't help but wonder how he managed to snag such a catch. Money was probably the answer, but let's not dwell on that as it's not relevant to my tale. Upon arriving at Marshall's, George and Jack, along with their wives, joined us, and it dawned on me why they hadn't traveled with us. I did wonder why I hadn't been informed I could bring a guest, though I didn't have anyone specific in mind. But if wives were invited, surely girlfriends would be too. I chalked it up to an oversight by Bill Wilkins. Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins occupied seats at the head table alongside Old Man Marshall, his wife, and all his directors, as well as, I presumed, the executives from some of the other firms that contracted with him. The 5 of us roamed around the tables, searching for our assigned seats. There was a bit of concern when we found seats designated for Jack, George, and their wives, but couldn't locate mine nearby. I wondered for a while, beginning to suspect that I had been overlooked. Frankly, if I couldn't find my seat, I planned to slip outside and wait until after the meal. However, suddenly, Thelma tapped me on the shoulder and directed me to my seat, which was next to hers. I'm not as foolish as I may appear. Thelma was sitting in the spot where my escort would have been seated if I had been informed I could bring one. That meant, naturally, that I was occupying the spot where her escort should have been, leaving me with the distinct impression that I had been set up. Old Man Marshall circulated among the guests while we waited for everyone to settle in. When he reached me, he expressed gratitude for my attendance and the excellent work I had done on his behalf. Then he said, "Well, my boy, our delightful Thelma here didn't have an escort for this evening. Would you mind looking after her for me?" I reassured him that I would, but couldn't help but wonder why the charming Thelma hadn't managed to secure a date that evening. The meal was catered by an outside service as all the cafeteria staff had been invited. Some of them sat at our table, meticulously observing every move and dish served by the caterers. It seemed as though no meal had ever been inspected so closely. Following the meal, there were seemingly endless speeches, after which the tables were pushed aside and a band began to play. The music was generic, designed to appeal to the diverse age range of the staff, spanning from 16 to 60. Thelma and I danced together, but a few guys approached and asked her to dance as well. By around 10:30, I had perhaps indulged in a bit more of the complimentary drinks than I should have. While dancing to a slow song with Thelma, which I found somewhat stimulating, I couldn't resist asking her why she hadn't managed to find a date for the evening. Thelma giggled, indicating that she too might have had a bit too much to drink. "Don't be ridiculous. I could have easily found other guys who would have been eager to join, but I chose to spend the evening with you." "Why? Do you genuinely want to know?" "I wouldn't ask if I didn't." "Well, because you piqued my interest." "Oh, I intrigue you, do I? And why is that?" "Well, you're different." I must have looked puzzled, so she clarified. "Come on, you know what I mean. You don't pursue me like the other guys do." "I'm curious, why? Do you not find me attractive, or perhaps you're interested in men?" "Thelma, no. I'm definitely of a traditional orientation, and I do find you very attractive." "Ah, so you have a steady girlfriend then?" "No, actually, I don't at the moment." "Then why have you never asked me out?" "I haven't said or done anything to offend you, have I?" "Quite the contrary, Thelma. You're a lovely young woman, as I mentioned." "But you're, what, 18? 19? "No, 19, Thelma confirmed. I'm 24, constantly on the road for 5 days a week, often spending several nights away. I desire a stable relationship, but please don't take this personally. I'm seeking a partner who's okay with me returning home on Friday nights and simply going to the pub for a drink. Someone who won't be out with other men when I'm away. If you were seeking an unconventional date with me, you've had that tonight. However, I don't believe you're ready to settle down yet. You enjoy the attention too much when men pursue you. Is that so? Yes, I'm afraid it is. You're not upset, are you? Maybe a little disappointed. Can I at least steal a kiss under the mistletoe tonight? Of course, it would be my pleasure. It seemed like Thelma had something to demonstrate. Afterward, every time we danced, we ended up beneath that cursed mistletoe. Around 1 a.m, George approached and informed me that Mr. Wilkins was prepared to depart. I bid Thelma good night with a kiss as she accompanied me to the car. As the car exited the parking lot, I glanced back to witness another man approach her and put his arm around her. The next week, I had a different job, so I didn't go to Marshall's. The week after that, they closed for the Christmas break. The boss tricked me into working on the day after Boxing Day for a special task, which ended up taking me to Aberdeen over the New Year holiday. Back then, oil exploration in the North Sea had just begun, and I had to transport urgently needed research equipment there. The weather was awful, and I spent nearly 2 weeks waiting at the harbor for the ship to arrive so I could unload the gear. Despite the wait, I enjoyed myself in the pubs there. There's nowhere better to celebrate New Year's Eve than Scotland, even if the weather is terrible. However, by the time the ship I was waiting for finally showed up, the novelty had worn off. It turned out the ship had sought shelter from the storm in another port along the coast, and nobody thought to inform me to meet them there. But hey, I was just a humble truck driver. Who cared about me anyway? When I returned to the southern region, I decided to take a couple of days off to make up for being away during the New Year period. I won't say the boss approved, but he was aware of my tendency to speak my mind to bosses if I felt aggrieved, and there were plenty of driving jobs available at the time for those who knew what they were doing. On Wednesday morning, I parked at Marshall's loading bay. Stepping into the dispatch office, I was taken aback. Seated in Thelma's chair was a woman I barely recognized, dressed in a loose-fitting jumper and slacks, with her hair tied back in a ponytail. As soon as she spotted me, she leaped out of her chair and hurried over. Before I could utter a word, her arms encircled my neck and her tongue ventured deep into my mouth. "Good Lord, what are you trying to do, smother me?" I exclaimed when she finally paused for breath. "I missed you." "Now tell me, do I meet your standards now?" she pressed. "Listen, Thelma, I'm not sure what to say. Tell me if you still see me as some sort of promiscuous girl who flits from one guy to another every night. I never implied such a thing. Maybe not directly, but you insinuated it. So, am I acceptable as your girl now? Of course, you always have been, but... Great! So I'll expect you to pick me up on Friday night. Here's my address and your schedule for the rest of the week. I've arranged things so you can finish early on Friday. Now you better get going. You've got a lot on today and tomorrow." What could I possibly say or do that wouldn't upset her? So, like a sheep to the slaughter, I kissed her and returned to the loading bays to load my truck. On Friday evening, I arrived at her house around 7 o'clock to pick her up. She emerged from the house with an overnight bag in hand. What's the bag for, Thelma?" I asked, feeling nervous. "Well, I thought since you wanted to go to the local pub, which is at least 35 miles away from here, I could stay over at your place instead. That way, you wouldn't have to drive back and forth all weekend to pick me up and drop me off," she suggested. So, Thelma ended up staying over at my parents' house that weekend, not in my bed but in my sister's, both of whom were married and no longer living at home. Thelma slept in their old room. The next weekend, I stayed at her parents' house, and we explored the pubs in her neighborhood. Her parents were welcoming. I got along well with her father and younger brother. Initially, I wasn't sure how her mother felt about me, but she warmed up to me eventually. And you know what? Thelma had me completely wrapped around her finger from that first weekend onward. She never wore anything suggestive at work or elsewhere, at least as far as I knew, except when we were together. Then, surprisingly, she dressed to the nines. It didn't take long to realize that Thelma wasn't a virgin, though I never assumed she was. I also learned that she couldn't take birth control pills. They didn't agree with her. As a result, we didn't make love very often and were always protected. 3 months later, we found ourselves engaged, and before I realized it, we had placed a deposit on a rundown old house situated almost exactly halfway between our parents' residences. We dedicated all our spare time over the next year to practically rebuilding the place, bringing it up to modern standards. Once the house was complete, the natural progression was to tie the knot, which we promptly did. Our reception took place in Marshall's canteen, with the canteen staff handling the catering. Old man Marshall was present, expressing his pleasure at seeing us together. I've never been entirely certain of his involvement in Thelma's scheme to unite us. Perhaps Thelma merely manipulated him, as I later discovered she did with many others. Life was blissful for the following years. Thelma became pregnant fairly soon after our marriage. We mostly used condoms, but being newlyweds, things occasionally became a bit hectic, as you can imagine. After having our first child, Tracy, we promptly decided to expand our family with our second child, Helen. We concluded that 2 children would suffice for us, and Thelma arranged a permanent solution for birth control. However, during Thelma's pregnancy with Helen, she encountered some complications that concerned the doctors, leading to her early hospitalization and close monitoring. While Thelma was still pregnant with Tracy, I received a call from Mr. Marshall. Essentially, his transport manager was retiring, leaving him in a tough spot. With Thelma on maternity leave, he had already approached Bill Wilkins and now asked me to step in as the interim transport manager until Thelma returned to work. Accepting somewhat reluctantly, I saw the convenience of being nearby when Thelma gave birth rather than traveling all over the country while she nursed. Reluctantly, I accepted. However, the decision became permanent when Thelma and I opted for a second child, tying my position at Marshall's to a long-term commitment. The job wasn't difficult. It simply required knowledge of vehicles and a knack for planning truck routes. Over time, I found myself rather enjoying it, though not as much as being out on the road. The pay was better, and there was no overtime required. I was somewhat relieved to have the opportunity to spend time with our 2 young children. I couldn't shake the feeling that they might inherit their mother's assertiveness as they grew older. Despite anticipating some challenges ahead, I resolved to deal with them as they arose. Life continued much like it does for many couples with young kids. I genuinely felt content with my lot, a good job, a comfortable home, a loving spouse, and 2 delightful daughters. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. If I were to pinpoint the beginning of my suspicions that something was amiss, I'd say it was when Tracy had just turned 6. One morning, while driving to work, I noticed a car behind me. Sure, it's normal to have other vehicles on the road, but did you catch that? I said the car behind me. Now, I want you to keep in mind that I've been working as a truck driver for a while. When you spend all day behind the wheel of a truck, especially if you're skilled at your job, you develop a keen awareness of your surroundings. There's always the possibility that the car behind you might be carrying some troublemakers who want to steal your cargo, especially if it's valuable, or it could be one of those dreaded unmarked police cars, which can be a headache for drivers trying to stick to a tight schedule. So if you know what you're doing, you keep an eye on the cars behind you. Every driver should do that as a matter of course, but what I'm talking about is paying attention to the specific car and its occupants. You can usually spot them from a mile away if you're alert enough, believe me. Now, the car I noticed behind me wasn't budging at every junction. If it fell behind, it would speed up and overtake everything until it was right back on my tail. It definitely wasn't a police car. They drive much more skillfully than this guy. But it was clear that he was following me. That evening, as I left work, I noticed another car tailing me. It was driven by a woman this time, but she followed me all the way home. The next morning, the same guy was there again, and in the evening, the woman followed me to the pub. On Thursday nights, I usually have a drink, just one since I'm driving, and play a game of snooker with some of my staff. We hadn't been at the pub long when I saw her come in, followed shortly after by the guy. They went to the bar separately and got their own drinks. Then things took a turn that I can only describe as absurd. While I was playing snooker, this woman was at the bar flaunting as much of herself as possible and staring at me so intensely that I could practically feel her eyes boring into my back. A few times during my game, our eyes met and she smiled at me. The only thing I couldn't figure out was who and why someone was trying to set me up. but I had no intention of playing along. I wasn't about to be taken for a fool. Whatever game they were trying to play, I believed I understood the reason behind the why question. Old Man Marshall epitomized a strong sense of family values, running his company as if it were one large family. As an outsider who had entered the firm through marriage to one of Marshall's favorite employees, I quickly earned favor myself, with rumors circulating that I was destined for advancement under Marshall's wing. I suspected jealousy or a fear of competition in the long term for promotions drove someone to try to manipulate me into actions that could jeopardize my marriage and reputation with Marshall. Unsure of the culprit's identity, I concealed my true intentions by ordering another drink before discreetly slipping out the back door unnoticed while heading to the restroom. Though I entertained the idea of turning the tables on them, my lack of certainty about who was orchestrating the setup left me uncertain of whom I could confide in. I opted to drive home, pondering how long they might have waited for my return from the restroom. The next morning, the man reappeared, but this time I shook him off easily. Later that evening, as I left Marshall's yard, the woman began tailing me immediately. I decided to take her on a detour through a familiar industrial estate where I knew the layout well from my truck driving days. Eventually, we reached a dead end. After parking, I slipped away from her line of sight between the buildings and circled around until I was behind her car. Suddenly appearing by her car door, I caught her off guard. Realizing I was onto her, she swiftly reversed the car at high speed, executing a slick turn that would impress even Rockford, and disappeared in moments. Frustrated with myself for letting her escape, I returned to my car and headed home. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. They seemed to have stopped following me, perhaps giving up once they realized I was aware of them. 2 weeks later, upon my arrival at the pub on Thursday night, a different woman was seated at the bar. As I bought my drink, she made a remark. Initially, I didn't connect her to the previous two women. It wasn't until she joined me at the jukebox while I was selecting songs that it clicked. "Get lost, lady, and tell your pals I'm not as naive as I seem," I told her. "And let that prat with the Granada know that if I ever see him again, I'll give him a piece of my mind." The woman was taken aback. She appeared quite shocked and promptly left the pub. I had noticed the Ford Granada in the parking lot when I arrived, but not its driver. About a month later, Thelma stumbled in her high heels, breaking a bone in her ankle. She called me frantically from the hospital, asking me to pick up the girls. When I arrived, the doctor informed me that although the fracture wasn't severe, it required immobilization with plaster. However, there was a complication. Thelma's ankle had swollen, necessitating a delay until the swelling subsided before applying the plaster. Consequently, Thelma had to remain in the hospital until then. This situation required me to take a few days off to care for the girls. As it occurred during the school summer break, it was a refreshing change for me to assume both parental roles. Despite their amusement at my cooking attempts, I know they had a blast teasing me. Cooking isn't my forte. I struggled with timing to ensure all components finished cooking simultaneously. How on earth do you coordinate everything to be ready at the same time? While I was multitasking in the kitchen that evening, the phone rang. Unable to answer it myself, I called upon Tracy to pick up at 6. I figured she was capable. After all, we had coached her on what to do and say. "Oops, sorry, Uncle Frank. Mommy's at the hospital. She hurt her leg. Daddy's taking care of us." "Bye," Tracy said, then hung up. "Who was that, Tracy?" I inquired. "Just Uncle Frank," she casually replied. However, her response raised a red flag for me. Who on earth was Uncle Frank? I'd never heard of him before. I could investigate further, but Helen called Tracy from the other room, diverting her attention. Intrigued, I followed Tracy, though for some reason I hesitated to enter the playroom. "You're going to be in trouble with Mom. You broke your promise to Mom that you wouldn't tell Dad about Uncle Frank." "What did I just hear my daughter say?" I pondered, then caught Tracy's response, a typical child's defense. "I didn't tell Dad about Uncle Frank." Then ensued the usual back and forth of "you did, and I didn't." I opted not to engage in the argument. Both girls seemed aware that I wasn't supposed to know about Uncle Frank, and jumping into the conversation would put them on guard. It seemed wiser to let it be and wait until they were more relaxed. Yet, I was troubled. I couldn't fathom why Thelma would want to keep some man a secret from me unless... Could it be? That was a question I truly didn't want to entertain. Perhaps denial was preventing me from considering such thoughts. Thelma's ankle remained swollen overnight, contrary to the doctor's expectation. To me, it appeared even more swollen than the previous day. When the nurse mentioned it could take up to a week to reduce, I realized I needed help at home before the girls fell ill or showed signs of malnutrition from avoiding my cooking. My sister offered to stay and assist with the girls, allowing me to spend some time at the office. Sarah brought her 9-year-old daughter, Marcy, along. I didn't particularly warm to Marcy. She seemed to take after her mother, who, despite being my sister, wasn't one of my favorite people when we were younger. However, our relationship had improved as we got older. I'm not entirely sure of my motives. Perhaps I needed someone to confide in, so I ended up sharing about Uncle Frank with Sarah. It's possible that my daughters were sworn to secrecy by Thelma, but she might not have specified other people. After I told Sarah, she pondered for a moment before saying, "Do you think Thelma's?" "I'm unsure, Sarah, but I'm uncomfortable with my family keeping things from me." "Is that why you resented Ginny and me when we were young? We never revealed anything to you." "It's a possibility, but I won't tolerate my wife keeping secrets from me, especially involving other men." "I can understand that. Thelma is quite attractive. I've always wondered how you won her over." "The truth is, Sarah, I didn't pursue Thelma. It was the other way around." "Well, she certainly had an eye for quality. I'll concede that much." "So, what's your agenda here? Want me to inquire with the girls about this Frank for you?" "I figured they might be more willing to confide in you." I distinctly recall Helen mentioning that their mother had made them swear not to divulge anything to me about him. Now, they might rationalize that they're not betraying her trust if they share with you. "Leave it to me, and I'll see what information I can gather." "Thanks, sis, but try not to make it too conspicuous and alert them." The next morning, I left Sarah with the kids and headed to work. In the afternoon, I visited Thelma at the hospital, where she mentioned that Sarah had spent about an hour with the girls earlier that day. For some reason, I felt compelled to ask Thelma if there was something on her mind. It seemed to confuse her. All she could come up with was a list of unpaid bills and household tasks. Later that night, after Sarah had tucked the children in bed, she sat me down at the kitchen table, her expression stern. "Well, I have no idea who this Frank guy is, but I believe you should figure out what's happening. Did you inquire with the girls about him? What did they say?" "Don't be silly. I assigned Marcy to investigate. I figured the girls wouldn't recognize her as an adult, and well, you know how kids are. Anyway, about this Frank fellow, apparently Thelma used to converse with him outside the school while waiting for the girls to be dismissed. According to the girls, he's divorced and his kids are supposed to attend their school. They claim it's his only opportunity to see them since he doesn't live with his wife, who supposedly has custody and allegedly makes it hard for him to visit. So, he's said to be watching them in the school playground. But why keep that from me?" Marcy isn't naive. She addressed that question too. According to the girls, Frank's wife is said to work at your company, and the rumor is you might inform her that he's monitoring the children at the school. "Oh, I understand now. Well, I guess that explains it. But surely Thelma doesn't believe I would report the guy to his wife? That story is complete nonsense. Just think about it. If this guy Frank was really at the school when the kids were leaving, why wouldn't his supposed ex-wife see him there?" When I sent Marcy to ask a few more questions, I got really concerned. "Neither of your daughters knows who Frank's kids are. Come on, it's a small school. It doesn't add up. Plus, apparently, sometimes when Thelma takes the girls to the park after school, Frank is there too. And what's even more suspicious, he's been spotted at the park during school holidays and has been seen with Thelma and the girls at the shopping center multiple times. He buys the kids ice cream, candy, and burgers. Brother, you've got a serious issue, and you need to figure it out fast. It's possible that Thelma was planning to meet Frank the other day when she had her accident. Maybe that's why he called her to ask why she never showed up. Do you believe they're having an affair? How would I even begin to speculate? But something suspicious is definitely happening, and we need to uncover what it is." I'm relieved you're on the same page because I'm starting to feel lost. Let's not jump to conclusions. There might be a perfectly innocent explanation we're overlooking, though honestly, I doubt it. Think back, brother. Can you recall anything Thelma has said or done recently that might be significant? Anything unusual or out of character? Well, not from Thelma directly, but something odd did occur the other week. I proceeded to recount the incident of being followed and approached by the two girls at the pub, which I could only interpret as them trying to flirt with me. Sarah was just as puzzled by that revelation. The following day unfolded much like the one before. Thelma's ankle was showing promising signs of reduced swelling, and the nurses assured me that her recovery was progressing well. They anticipated she'd be able to return home by the weekend. Later that evening, after tucking the children into bed once again, Sarah, who had been visibly anxious since my arrival, eagerly sought a private conversation. As soon as the kitchen door closed, she wasted no time in asking, "What color was the car that followed you?" "It was a maroon Ford Granada." "Why do you ask?" "Close enough. The girls described it as dark red. I suspect it was Frank who trailed you. And there's troubling news. Marcy believes the girls might have been inside that car. They provided her with detailed descriptions of its interior, mentioning its size, the plushness of the seats, and how they couldn't open the doors from the inside because of child locks. Kids wouldn't notice such details unless they had been inside the vehicle. I'm on board with that. So today, I pulled a favor and phoned Bill Wilkins. He's got connections in the police force, and he's attempting to obtain the identities and addresses linked to the license plates of those cars that trailed me. Smart move, buddy. You probably owe Marcy a huge favor for all the work she's been putting in with the girls. Yeah, I realize that I'm fortunate she's as cunning as her mother. I'm not sure if I should take that as a compliment or not, Sarah responded with a smile. On Friday morning, Bill Wilkins phoned me at the office bright and early. He informed me that the Granada was owned by a certain Frank Williams, who had a reputation with the police. As for the other two cars, they had been rented from a budget car rental agency. Interestingly, one of them hadn't been brought back, and the renter, a man, had utilized fake documents to rent both vehicles. That afternoon, after making some phone calls, I went to the hospital to pick up Thelma. I had a brief conversation with the nurse I'd been in contact with all week before Thelma realized I was there. After some prompting, she revealed that a man had been visiting Thelma every afternoon after I left. It struck me as odd because he never brought anything with him for Thelma. Most people usually bring something, even if it's just a get-well card. I suspected that our Frank Williams wouldn't want to leave any evidence that might arouse my curiosity. Men like Frank Williams are pretty clever when they're up to something, but if he thought he could get away with what I suspected he was planning, he had another thing coming. That evening, when we arrived home, Thelma was surprised that the children weren't at the door to greet us. As she made her way inside on her crutches, she asked me where they were. I sent them to my parents' place for a few days, thinking it would give you some time to sort things out. Oh, that wasn't necessary, Thelma replied, settling herself on the sofa in the lounge. I would have preferred if they were here. But I believe it was necessary, Thelma. We have a lot to sort out in the next couple of days. I don't want the girls to get unnecessarily upset. What things? Thelma asked as Sarah entered the room with a tray of tea and coffee. Oh, Sarah, you're still here. You didn't need to stay. I'm sure I can take care of myself and the children. I can manage on my ankle now that it's in plaster. I'm not here for you, Thelma. I'm here for my brother. Sarah's voice dripped with venom. Thelma's face drained of color, and she turned to me. What's going on here? So, Thelma, I was going to ask you exactly what's going on between you and Frank Williams, I said. Thelma glanced at me, then at Sarah, and back at me. It seemed like she was momentarily speechless. Then she made up her mind. Well, I guess you figured it out, haven't you? It was bound to happen eventually. I'm sorry, but I've developed feelings for someone else. I didn't plan on telling you yet, but I'm going to file for divorce and marry Frank. Just like that? I inquired. Yes, I've been struggling to find the right way to break it to you for weeks now. I didn't want to cause you more pain than necessary. Sarah started to speak, but the sound of movement behind her interrupted. That's all I needed to hear. I can start the process now. I'll be in touch, a voice from the hallway said. Then we heard the front door close. I exchanged a smile with Sarah before turning back to Thelma. It sounds like you were quite considerate. If only it weren't a fabrication. Did you persuade Frankie to set me up? What was the scheme? Was it supposed that I would be seduced by one of his familiar girlfriends, which would lead to a divorce? Convenient for you. I guess you thought then I'd be obligated to pay you alimony, right? What a charming wife I once had. Well, tough luck. I didn't fall for your scheme. I'll admit the idea was clever. You wanted to leave me with my stable job and shack up with an unemployed jerk, expecting me to support you in your new life. I have no idea what you're talking about. What setup? If you're clueless, you better ask your oddball boyfriend. Here's how it's going to be. You have the weekend to remove all your belongings from my house. My lawyer is drafting the divorce papers as we speak. They'll be ready for you to sign on Monday. You're not allowed to do that. It's your turn to leave the house. I'll need it for the children. Oh no, darling, that's not happening. You and your strange boyfriend won't be anywhere near my children. I might allow you to visit them if either a social worker or I'm present. Actually, social services will be seeking that order from a judge tonight. What do you mean? They can't do that. Oh, but they can, darling. I've always found social workers to be a nuisance, but once they learned about Frank Williams and what you were planning, they've been very cooperative. You won't be allowed near the children anymore, and I suspect the police will want to speak with you as well. I don't understand. Why would the police want to speak with me? Oh, you stupid woman, Sarah interrupted, deciding to say whatever was on her mind, so I let her continue. What do you think Williams was doing hanging around the school? This man is infamous with a long criminal past. He wasn't after you, you naive fool. He was after your daughters. Thelma's expression was priceless. She looked from me to Sarah and back again. You're not telling the truth. Frank wouldn't act like that. Oh, really? Where do you think he's been for the last 7 years? He worked abroad, probably in the Far East. More like the Isle of Wight. Parker's prison is located there. It can be conditionally called abroad. Anyway, as soon as the police finish questioning him and my children, we'll find out if he harmed them. But let me warn you, if this scoundrel harms my children, I will do my best to punish both of you without involving the police. Sarah had to call an ambulance because Thelma suddenly fainted, and we couldn't bring her to her senses. It must have been either her father or her brother who picked her up from the hospital because I certainly didn't. I didn't see her again until the day we finalized the divorce paperwork. Thelma realized there was little use in seeking custody of the children because social services still had the order against her stating that she had endangered the girls. It was revealed that Thelma had entrusted the children to William's care on multiple occasions while she was at the hairdresser and similar places. However, the specialist who interviewed my daughters assured me that nothing had happened. They believed Williams was still in what they referred to as the grooming stage and was cautious not to scare them off by moving too quickly. Williams hadn't committed any crimes that the police could pin on him. They were confident he had stolen the rented car but hadn't used it for its intended purpose before things fell apart. When I inquired out of curiosity why they suspected Williams of stealing the car, the police inspector glanced at me and remarked, "Well, it's possible, sir, that you've been fortunate even if you feel you've had a tough time." The last unfortunate woman whom Williams seduced into his bed only to exploit her children was a widow. Her husband died in an unsolved hit-and-run accident. Now, the issue is we can't prove what Williams intended to do with the car, but we can speculate. If he remains in this area, we'll be keeping a very close watch on him. Not overly close, I hope, I quipped. The officers scanned the area to ensure no one else could overhear. Oh, I wouldn't worry too much about that, sir. As long as nobody ends up dead, you'd be surprised how long it takes for the officers assigned to watch him to take a restroom break. Of course, I never mentioned that to you. And make sure you have a solid alibi. There are plenty of well-meaning people who believe individuals like Williams are simply mentally unwell and deserving of sympathy. Personally, I think that if he were subjected to the harsh punishment that we usually have in prisons, it would be too lenient. He's a sly and wicked person. And sir, don't be too harsh on your wife. Williams is adept at manipulating people. If you had witnessed him in that interrogation room, you wouldn't believe how innocently he portrayed himself. She never had a chance once he set his sights on her. It wasn't until we allowed her to read Williams' file that she truly grasped the extent of his depravity. Reflecting on it now, I realize I might have narrowly escaped a terrible fate. Williams was clearly preparing for any possible outcome, but knowing what that despicable person had planned for my family, I resolved not to ignore his actions. However, I could afford to bide my time until things calmed down. Over the next few years, everything remained uncertain. Thelma wasn't permitted to see the children by herself, which was frustrating for both them and their mother as she couldn't take them out. Based on what the police and Thelma herself said, it seemed like she had no chance against Williams. I believe she wouldn't have tolerated him abusing our girls if she knew about it. I have to hold on to that belief for my own sanity. After about a year, I asked social services to relax the conditions for Thelma's visits with the children, and they agreed. Since the children were never placed in care, I ultimately had the final say. Thelma mentioned a few times that she wanted us to reconcile, but I made it clear that it wasn't going to happen. Knowing that William's car was parked outside some days while the children were at school, based on what the neighbors said, I couldn't believe they were just having Bible readings. Well, who knows? There's a lot of begetting in the Bible. I advised Thelma to look for another partner, which she eventually did. He seemed like a decent guy to me, although a little stubborn. It seems that he proposed to Thelma, but she refused until she could tell him everything. As far as I know, he listened to her explanation and then suddenly left without saying a word. 2 weeks later, Thelma deliberately crashed into Williams with her car outside the local police station. She noticed him hiding near another nearby school. Thelma called the police, which resulted in Williams being taken in for questioning. However, she waited outside the station until he was released and then drove her car into him as he walked along the sidewalk. After that, she reportedly drove to the river and jumped into the water. I'm not entirely sure that was her true intention. Thelma is quite adept at manipulating people, and I heard that there was a police car right behind her. After initially facing charges of manslaughter, Thelma's legal troubles were eventually resolved when the charges were dropped due to her unstable mental condition rendering her unfit to stand trial. She was placed under the care of a local psychiatric hospital, where it was determined that she posed no threat to the public. After about a month, she was released. She continued to attend therapy sessions regularly, and social services closely monitored her interactions with the children. Meanwhile, Sarah's husband Ralph took up employment on the oil rigs in the North Sea. Consequently, Sarah and her family practically moved in with me to assist in caring for the girls and managing Thelma's occasional visits. However, the frequency of her visits dwindled over time, and it felt like years since I had last spoken to her. I believe it was shortly before Ellen turned 10. One evening, Sarah, Ralph, and I sat in the kitchen reminiscing about our childhood. Naturally, we discussed Sarah and my summers spent in Weymouth. Ralph proposed the idea of all of us spending a fortnight there that summer. Sarah eagerly agreed, and before Ralph and I could grasp what was happening, she had invited Jenny and her family to join us. We rented 3 caravans next to each other at the same site where our family used to stay when we were kids. The children had a blast at the beach, and they were thrilled when we showed them all the places where we used to play. We even ran into a few locals we knew from our childhood. One morning, I took my 2 daughters for a stroll along the cliffs. Significant changes had occurred due to the erosion of the muddy cliff faces by the sea. It took me quite a while to locate the tree where Harry and I used to carve our initials annually. Some of them were still discernible. H&H 1959, Tracy remarked. I wonder who they were and where they are now. Well, one of them is right here next to you, I replied. You're joking, Dad, Tracy exclaimed. Then who was H? Oh, she was just a friend. What do you mean, was she your childhood sweetheart, Dad? Helen asked eagerly. I hadn't anticipated the situation I had gotten myself into. I guess she sort of was. I used to spend many enjoyable holidays here with her when I was your age, but I'm not sure if you could really call her my girlfriend. I only kissed her once. Was it good? Tracy asked, genuinely curious. Yes, it was lovely. I would have liked to kiss her more, but she didn't return the next year. Oh, that's sad. Were you very upset? Yes, I was, but let's talk about something else if you don't mind. We changed the subject, but for the rest of the holiday, wherever we went, my two daughters would ask if I had been there with Harry. Sarah and Jenny caught on quickly and would answer Tracy before I could downplay it or claim not to remember. Cakes and other treats made by Sarah and Jenny ended up with markings that looked remarkably similar to H&H. I tried to show my disapproval, but they all started laughing, and I couldn't help but join in. After we returned home from the holiday, things took a turn for the worse. At Tracy and Helen's insistence, my parents dug out old holiday photos of Harry and me from our childhood and showed them to my daughters. I have to give credit to my girls. Despite Harry's prominent birthmark in many of the photos, they never mentioned it or asked about it. I'm not sure if my sisters instructed them not to, but it was never brought up. The next year we visited Weymouth again, but it was just me, my daughters, Sarah, and Marcy. Ralph was supposed to join us, but he backed out last minute, citing a work-related issue. I was surprised at how calmly Sarah took it, considering he spent so much time away on the rigs. We successfully fit everyone into my car, including the luggage on the roof, for the trip to Weymouth. The initial days were pleasant as we settled in. However, during breakfast on Tuesday morning, my daughters suddenly expressed a desire to revisit the tree with carvings on its trunk. Around 10 o'clock, we embarked on our mission. The girls were particularly lively that morning, singing and dancing seemingly without cause. Upon reaching the tree, Tracy dashed up to it, exclaiming, "Yes, yes, he's done it! He's done it!" The girls gathered around the tree excitedly as Sarah and I approached. They stepped back. Beneath the 1959 carving, there was another inscription, H&H 1982. I gazed at it momentarily, trying to comprehend the situation. Suddenly, Ralph emerged from nearby bushes accompanied by two unfamiliar children. "She says you'll know where to find her. She instructed me to inform you that she's where you used to observe the courting couples. She wishes to meet you privately." I don't recall stopping to speak to Ralph. I just jogged off towards our old hiding spot, but when I arrived, Harry wasn't there. Disappointed and puzzled, I turned back. I hadn't gone far when Harry suddenly leaped out at me, a childhood game we used to play. "Jesus, Harry, you scared the living daylights out of me," was all I managed to say. "Well, it's a change for me being the one startled," she replied. Then we fell into our old habit of talking like we did as kids. When we returned to the tree, the others were gone. As Harry and I made our way back to the caravan, I shared a condensed version of my life story with him. Harry explained that after her father's death, her mother couldn't afford to keep the caravan and had sold it. She regretted not seeing me again as much as I did her. Eventually, her mother remarried a kind man who, when Harry was a teenager, paid a hefty sum to have her birthmark removed with an early laser technique. It wasn't entirely successful, but it boosted her self-esteem. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She mentioned that only one other thing had boosted her self-esteem to that extent, and that was when she had encountered me as a child. She recalled I was the only child she had ever met who never once commented on or inquired about her birthmark. After that, Harry proceeded to inform me that she had married a soldier and had two wonderful children with him. Sadly, he had died in a training accident in 1978. Since then, she had been residing with her stepfather, as her mother had passed away from a stroke some years prior. Ralph stumbled upon her situation somehow. Sarah later revealed that he had numerous colleagues on his oil rig who lived near the Bath area. Asking around, eventually, someone recalled the girl with the boy's name and a birthmark on her face. Ralph went down there and found her several weeks before the holiday, but they kept me unaware until that morning. Sarah mentioned she was genuinely afraid Helen and Tracy would accidentally reveal the secret on a couple of occasions. During the remainder of our holiday, Harry and her two children stayed with us in the caravan. Contrary to speculation, Harry and I didn't engage in any romantic involvement right away. Our bond goes way back to our childhood, and now as adults, we're taking the time to deepen our connection. While there's potential for something more between us, only time will tell. As for whether there's romance in the air, it's uncertain, but I'm hopeful, and I sense my children shared that sentiment too. The signs seem promising. To maximize our time together, everyone, including Harry's children, made an effort to give us space in Weymouth. As our holiday concluded, Ralph and Sarah took Tracy and Helen with them, while I drove Harry and her 2 children back to Bath. Life carries on. April 2006. After a whirlwind of trips up and down the M4 motorway for the next 6 months, Harry and her 2 children, Russell and Claire, finally moved in with me and my daughters. Shortly after the move, we encountered a small awkward situation when Helen and Tracy began calling Harry Mom and decided to refer to their own mother as Thelma. Despite Harry and I trying to discourage them by having Harry not respond when they called her Mom, it didn't work because the girls had the cooperation of Harry's children, Russell and Claire, who would echo whatever Helen and Tracy said. So whenever Harry responded, she was inadvertently answering to Helen or Tracy as well. I have to admit it took some adjusting, and Thelma wasn't pleased, to put it mildly. I'm not sure what transpired between Thelma and the girls, but eventually, she acquiesced to their wishes. Harry suggested that the girls threaten to cut ties with Thelma if she contested the matter. At times, I was taken aback by the hostility the girls harbored toward Thelma, which seemed to intensify as they grew older. Then one day, Harry informed me that my daughters weren't naive. As they matured, they realized what had nearly happened to them and understood why those social workers and police officers had posed all those seemingly trivial questions. Harry and I eventually tied the knot. It wasn't a hasty decision. We opted for a quiet ceremony in Bermuda of all places. It was a unique experience with local witnesses, and we kept our plans under wraps. It's amazing how long Harry managed to wear the spare ring without anyone noticing. Over time, Thelma's mental health deteriorated, exacerbated by her poor choice in partners. Despite her struggles, she was coherent enough to attend her daughter Tracy's wedding to her stepbrother Russell. She appeared healthier than she had in years, accompanied proudly by her father. Regrettably, her father passed away a few months later, and shortly thereafter. Thelma was committed by her brother. She now frequently resides in a private clinic, a costly arrangement that her brother and I find burdensome. Nevertheless, I believe I have a responsibility to care for the mother of my children. Harry and I are thoroughly content in our relationship. With our children grown and gone, we now spend the majority of our time at our cottage near Weymouth. We delight in strolling along the same paths we traversed in our youth, occasionally accompanied by our grandchildren. Life carries on.